Genesis 6 contains one of the most startling descriptions of God found in any religious text. It says, "The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled." For many, this statement creates an immediate crisis of logic. If God is truly omniscient, possessing a perfect, exhaustive knowledge of every future event, how can he regret a decision he knowingly chose to make? In a universe where every human action was pre-planned and seen before time began, the concept of divine regret seems impossible. There is no room for new information to surface, and therefore no obvious reason for God to reconsider his choice. If we interpret this as God discovering he made an intellectual error, we are no longer talking about the God of classical theology. An all-knowing being cannot be surprised by the outcome of his own work. The problem is compounded by the rest of the biblical canon, which frequently insists that God does not change. Numbers 23 and 1 Samuel 15 are explicit. God is not a human being that he should change his mind. These two biblical claims, that God changed his mind in Genesis and that God cannot change his mind in Samuel, exist side by side. Understanding how these statements coexist requires moving past the modern English definition of regret and into the specific linguistic landscape of the ancient Hebrew text. The context for this divine response begins with the contrast between Genesis 1 and Genesis 6. The world that God originally pronounced very good has, in a few short generations, spiraled into a state of universal corruption. The author uses exhaustive language to describe the scale of the crisis. Every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Central to this description is the Hebrew word Hamas. It refers to more than just physical conflict. It describes a society saturated with destructive injustice and celebrated violence. The creatures meant to represent God's rule had become the primary source of the world's ruin. The original, very good creation was now being actively unmade by the very hands meant to protect it. This brings us to the Hebrew verb nakam. While often translated as regret, its semantic range includes grieving or relenting. The narrator immediately adds God was grieved to his heart. This isn't a calculation error, it's a creator experiencing profound relational anguish. The text structures this as a direct comparison of two hearts. Verse 5 shows the human heart filled with evil. Verse 6 shows the divine heart filled with pain because of that evil. Genesis 6 isn't describing a failure of divine intelligence. It is describing the moral cost of human evil to the Creator. Visualize a judge. A static commitment to justice responds differently to innocence than guilt. The judge's character hasn't changed, only their relational stance. Similarly, God's immutable character shifts its stance because his holiness must respond to human corruption. This moral framework is what separates the Genesis account from other ancient flood stories, like the Atrahasis epic found on these tablets. In those myths, the gods flood the earth because humans are too noisy and keep the gods from sleeping. In Genesis, the flood isn't triggered by divine irritation. It is triggered by a moral wound. God's grief precedes his judgment. The flood itself is a symbolic decreation. The ordered boundaries established in Genesis 1 collapse, and the world returns to a state of watery chaos. However, if the narrator intended to show that God viewed human existence as a total mistake, the story would end here. A permanent return to chaos would be the only logical conclusion for a creator who truly wished he had never started. Instead, the narrative introduces a turning point. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Before the judgment even begins, God has already initiated a plan for preservation. The preservation of Noah indicates that God's original purpose for humanity hadn't failed. Humanity had departed from the design, but the Creator remained committed to the relationship. But the flood doesn't actually solve the problem. In chapter 8, after the waters recede, the text notes that the human heart is still inclined toward evil. This reveals a profound theological limit. While judgment can remove the people who commit evil, it cannot remove the presence of sin from the human heart itself. This leaves the story of Genesis with a massive unresolved tension. If judgment cannot fix the heart, how can a holy God continue to live with a humanity that grieves him? The rest of the biblical canon moves through the covenants toward a solution that doesn't involve the destruction of the creatures, but the transformation of the heart. Divine regret isn't a sign of ignorance. It is the ultimate evidence of God's relational vulnerability. If God remained indifferent to evil, he would not grieve. Within Christian theology, that same grieving Creator resolves the tension not by flooding the world again, but by bearing the weight of human evil himself. The grief of Genesis 6 is the first step on the road to the cross.